Elara Vance was a widow. That was the first and last thing most people in the town of Meridian knew about her. She had arrived 5 years prior with her husband, Elias, a quiet man with calloused hands and eyes that saw the world in layers of rock and time. He had bought the most useless parcel of land in the county, a steep, north-facing hillside of fractured shale and stubborn juniper, 3 miles out of town. The townsfolk had snickered then, too. Then Elias had died. A sudden fever took him in the spring, leaving Elara with the useless land, a strong-backed horse named Shale, and a collection of leather-bound journals filled with his precise, angular script. She owned little else. Her cabin was small, built by Elias himself, sturdy but plain. It stood as a lonely testament to a life cut short. For a year, she was just a ghost, a shape seen at the general store once a month, trading preserved goods for salt, flour, and kerosene. She spoke little. Her face was calm, her eyes holding a quiet sorrow that asked for nothing. Then, in the early summer of 1888, she began her project. It was this project that transformed her from a forgotten widow into the town fool. The plan was detailed in Elias's final journal. It was not a whim, but a conclusion born of years of studying geology, weather patterns, and history. He had seen the cycles. He had read the land. He believed a winter of mythic violence was not a matter of if, but when. His final entries were a blueprint for survival, a design for a structure he called the thermal anchor. Elara took these plans to the only authority Meridian had, Mayor Thompson. He was a man whose considerable girth was matched only by his considerable self-importance. He sat behind a large oak desk, his office in the newly constructed town hall, a proud 2-story building with large glass windows. She laid the schematics on his desk. They showed a cross-section of the hillside, a long, deep excavation. A reinforced living space built directly into the rock and earth, with a low, sod-covered roof designed to be buried. There were diagrams of clever ventilation shafts, disguised as simple rock cairns, and a deep cold sink for preserving food. "I intend to build this," she said, her voice even. "I believe the town should consider similar preparations." Mayor Thompson peered at the drawings through his spectacles. He traced a line with a thick finger. He puffed out his cheeks. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Mrs. Vance," he began, the title a condescending balm. "This is a burrow. Are you a prairie dog?" He laughed at his own joke. "We in Meridian are civilized people. We build with timber and glass. We look up at the sky. We don't hide from it under the dirt." He pushed the papers back toward her. "This is morbid, unhealthy. I suggest you spend your time in church, not digging your own grave." The dismissal was absolute. The story, however, was just beginning. The mayor told the tale at the saloon that night, embellishing it for comedic effect. The idea of the quiet widow digging a hole to live in was too rich to pass up. It became the town's favorite new joke. Silas Croft, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, heard the story and bellowed with laughter. He had just completed a magnificent new barn, the largest structure for 100 miles. It was a monument to his success, built with expensive Oregon pine, a gambrel roof, and a row of glass windows to catch the morning sun. "A burrow," Croft would say to anyone who would listen, slapping his thigh. "While I'm building a palace for my livestock, she's building a tomb for herself. Let her have at it. It's a free country, even for the mad." Dr. Hemlock, a man of rigid science and little imagination, was more clinical in his scorn. He stopped Elara outside the general store one day. "Ma'am, "As a physician, I must advise you," he said, his tone dripping with professional concern. "Living underground is a recipe for consumption. The damp, the lack of light, the foul air. You will sicken and die. It is an unscientific and primitive notion." Elara simply looked at him. She had read Elias's notes on geothermal stability and passive air exchange. She knew more about the science of her shelter than the doctor knew about his own medicines. "Thank you for your concern, doctor," she said, and walked away. The town gave her project a name: Vance's Folly. The phrase, "pulling a Vance," quickly entered the local lexicon, meaning to engage in a pointless, insane task. The children would walk past the edge of her property and chant it like a nursery rhyme. The mockery did not touch her. It was like the wind against the hillside she was excavating, a constant, meaningless noise. She had a purpose. She had the journals. She had the memory of Elias's serious, loving face as he had explained the principles to her. Pride was a luxury she could not afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered. The work began on June 1st, 1888. Her only companion was Shale, the big roan horse. He was her beast of burden, her silent confidant. The first task was clearing the site. She used Shale to drag away the stubborn juniper trees, their roots clinging to the rock like desperate fingers. Then came the digging. The topsoil was thin, giving way quickly to a dense layer of clay and then to the fractured shale of the hillside itself. This was the brutal part of the labor. She used a heavy pickaxe, a steel pry bar, and a shovel. Her hands, already calloused, bled and blistered, then healed into something tougher than leather. Each morning she rose before the sun. She ate a simple meal of oats and coffee. She fed and watered Shale, and then she worked. The rhythm of it became her life, the swing of the pick, the scrape of the shovel, the groan of the wheelbarrow as she hauled load after load of rock and earth away from the growing cavity in the hill. She was not just digging a hole, she was an engineer. Following Elias's plans, she was meticulous. The walls were sloped at a precise 5-degree angle to prevent collapse. She left a thick spine of solid rock running down the center, which would become the main support for the roof beams. The town watched her, at first with amusement, then with a kind of morbid pity. Men would ride out on their way to check their herds, stopping at a distance to observe the small figure of the woman, rhythmically swinging the heavy tool. They would shake their heads and ride on, the story of her madness confirmed. "She'll break her back before the first frost," Silas Croft declared. "And for what? A damp hole in the ground." By August, the main chamber was excavated. It was 50 feet long and 20 feet wide, a gaping wound in the earth. Now came the construction. She felled timber from the small copse of pine on the southern edge of her property, the only good trees on the land. She used shale to drag the logs to the site. Using a block and tackle system Elias had designed, she painstakingly hoisted the massive ridge beams into place, setting them on the central rock spine and into notches she had carved in the outer rock walls. The technical details were her scripture. She built the 2 ventilation shafts first, lining them with flat stones and creating a cap that would allow air to circulate but keep snow out. One shaft was low on the north wall to draw in the cold, dense air. The other was high on the south wall to exhaust the warmer, stale air. It was a simple, brilliant system of passive circulation. She built a stone hearth and chimney at the far end of the chamber, the stonework tight and perfect. She knew a fire would be a luxury, not a necessity. The earth itself would provide the heat. "The average ground temperature 50 feet deep," Elias had written, "remains a constant 54 degrees, regardless of the air temperature outside." The shelter was a geothermal battery. September was for the roof. She laid thick planks over the beams, followed by a layer of oilcloth for waterproofing. Then, painstakingly, she and Shale began hauling the excavated earth back, laying it over the roof, packing it down. Finally, she transplanted the sod she had carefully set aside months before. By the end of the month, the structure had vanished back into the hillside. All that was visible was a low, grassy mound, the stone chimney, and the heavy oak door set deep into the earth. October arrived. The aspens in the valley turned a brilliant, trembling gold. The air grew crisp. The town of Meridian was bustling, preparing for winter in the usual way. They laid in supplies of firewood, salted meat, and flour. There was a sense of satisfaction, of prosperity. The harvest had been good. Silas Croft's new barn was filled to the rafters with hay. Elara's preparations were different. She spent the first 2 weeks of October harvesting the last of her garden and the wild berries from the hills. Inside the shelter, she filled the shelves of the cold sink Elias had designed, a deep pit in the floor with a separate air intake that kept the temperature just above freezing. Jars of preserved vegetables, smoked fish, and dried fruit filled the space. She had enough food to last a year. It was on October 15th that she saw the first sign. It was the squirrels. They were frantic, not just gathering, but hoarding with a desperate, manic energy she had never witnessed before. They stripped every pine cone from the trees, burying them in a frenzy. Elias had written about it in his journals. Trust the squirrels. Their desperation is a barometer of the coming hardship. 2 days later, on October 17th, the geese flew south. It was a month early. They did not fly in their usual confident V-shaped formations. They flew in a great, panicked river, their calls sounding thin and desperate in the high, cold air. On October 20th, a strange silence fell. The usual chatter of birds and insects ceased. The air became heavy, still. A metallic scent, like cold iron, tinged the wind. She checked the barometer Elias had left her. The needle had dropped lower than she had ever seen it. It was a plunge that defied the clear blue sky. She knew. The time for labor was over. The time for waiting had begun. She brought the last of her supplies inside. She filled every water barrel from her well. She stacked a small, neat pile of firewood by the hearth, not for warmth, but for light and cooking. She led Shale into his specially prepared stall at the back of the shelter, a space with ample feed, water, and bedding. The horse seemed to sense the change, entering the dark space without protest. She stood at the doorway of her shelter and looked down at the town of Meridian. The lights were beginning to twinkle in the dusk. Smoke curled from the chimneys. She could hear the faint sound of a piano from the saloon. They were oblivious, content in their proud, fragile buildings. A part of her considered walking down there, to stand in the mayor's office and show him the barometer, to tell Silas Croft that his glass windows were a weakness, not a strength, to explain to Dr. Hemlock that the real sickness was pride. But she knew what would happen. They would laugh. They would call her the mad prophet of the borough. Her warning would be just another chapter in the legend of Vance's folly. They had made their choice when they chose mockery over caution. So she made hers. She closed the heavy oak door. She slid the 3 thick wooden bars into place. The sound of them seating into their brackets was a sound of finality. Inside, the silence was absolute. The air was cool and still. She lit a single lantern. Its light cast a warm, steady glow on the stone and wood. She was not underground. She was safe. The storm arrived on October 29th, 1888. It did not come as snow. It came as wind. It began at dusk, a low moan from the north that grew steadily into a shriek. It was a physical blow, a solid wall of moving air that hit the valley like a fist. The people of Meridian, comfortable in their homes, looked up from their dinners, annoyed by the rattle of their windows. By midnight, the annoyance had become fear. The shriek had become a roar, a sound of cosmic violence that seemed to want to tear the world apart. The wind was a solid thing, a battering ram that never ceased. It was a wind that stripped the bark from the trees, leaving them pale and naked. It was a wind that picked up gravel from the streets and turned it into sandblasting grit. The first of the town's proud structures to fail was Silas Croft's new barn. The magnificent glass windows, his great pride, shattered first, imploding with a sound like a cannon blast. The wind poured into the vast interior, and with no escape, it lifted the huge gambrel roof from its moorings. The entire structure came apart like a child's toy, its expensive Oregon pine scattered for miles across the frozen landscape. Croft's prize cattle, exposed to the killing wind, were dead within an hour. Next was the town hall. The wind found a seam under the eaves of the roof and began to peel it back, sheet by sheet, like the lid of a tin can. Mayor Thompson, huddled with his family in the cellar, could hear the destruction above them, the sound of his authority being dismantled timber by timber. The town's conventional systems collapsed in minutes. Power lines, a recent and proud addition, snapped and went dark. The water tower, frozen solid, was battered until its supports buckled. The supply train, due the next day, would not be coming. Nothing was coming. The world had been reduced to the valley, and the valley was being erased by the wind. Inside her shelter, Elara Vance heard almost nothing. The roar of the storm was a distant, muffled hum, like a memory of a bad dream. The temperature inside the thermal anchor held at a steady 54 degrees. She lit a small fire in the hearth, more for cheer than for heat, and read one of Elias's books by its light. Shale shifted contentedly in his stall. The air was fresh, circulating slowly through the stone-lined vents. She was an island of calm in an ocean of fury. The wind raged for 2 days. Then, the snow came. It was a snow of impossible quantity. It fell not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding curtain. It buried the wreckage of the town. It buried the roads. It buried the pale, bark-stripped trees. It piled in monstrous drifts against the houses that remained standing, sealing doors and windows. When the snow finally stopped, after another full day, the valley was a uniform, silent, white desert. The town of Meridian was gone, entombed in a grave of its own making. For 2 days, there was only silence. Inside the town, survival was measured in logs for the fire. When the firewood ran out, they started burning furniture. When the food in the pantry was gone, there was nothing. The cold was a living entity. It seeped through the walls of their proud, civilized houses. It cracked the plaster and turned every breath to ice. The first to venture out was Dr. Hemlock. His house, being small and well-built, had survived, but his firewood was gone, and his wife was sick. Wrapped in every layer he owned, he clawed his way out of a second-story window and onto the surface of the snow, which was packed as hard as stone. The landscape was unrecognizable. It was a rolling sea of white, with only the tallest of the broken roofs visible. He was a man of science, but he was lost. He didn't know where to go. He only knew that staying put was death. He began to walk, stumbling through the drifts, his mind numb with cold and despair. And then he saw it. Or rather, he saw what wasn't there. he saw the gentle, undisturbed slope of the hill where Vance's Folly was supposed to be. But rising from it was a thin, impossible wisp of smoke. Hope, alien and agonizing, flared in his chest. He staggered toward it. He fell, he crawled, he pushed himself forward. It took him over an hour to cross the 3 miles. He finally reached the low mound, the source of the smoke, a simple stone chimney, warm to the touch. He searched frantically for a door, his frozen fingers clawing at the snow. He found the top of the oak frame and began to dig. Inside, Elara heard the scratching. It was faint at first, then more frantic. She picked up her lantern, unbarred the door, and pushed it open. A cascade of snow fell inside, and with it, a figure. Dr. Hemlock lay on the floor, the half-frozen ruin of a man. His face was white with frostbite, his clothes stiff with ice. He looked up at her, his eyes wild with desperation and shame. The man of science, who had warned her of the dangers of damp and foul air, was dying in a world of sterile, killing cold. Elara did not say a word. There was no, "I told you so." There was no gloating. There was only a calm, efficient compassion. She dragged him inside, away from the door. She barred it again against the cold. She stripped off his frozen clothes and wrapped him in thick wool blankets. She sat him by the fire and forced warm broth between his chapped lips. He was the first. When he could finally speak, his voice was a raw whisper. "There are others. My wife, the Thompsons, Croft." "You will rest," Elara said, her voice firm. "When you are strong, you will show me the way." The next day, Elara and a recovered, deeply humbled Dr. Hemlock ventured out. She wore the snowshoes Elias had made years ago. They moved across the surface of the frozen world. The doctor, guided by the few visible landmarks, led her to the houses where survivors might be. One by one, they rescued them. A desperate, frozen procession of the humbled. They brought out Mayor Thompson and his family, their faces gaunt with hunger. They rescued the store owner, the blacksmith, the seamstress. Each person who had ever laughed at her, who had ever used her name as a punchline, was now led to the door of Vance's Folly, a door that opened into impossible warmth and safety. Elara welcomed them all. The shelter, which had seemed so large for one, was now crowded. But it was a space of life. She became their leader, not by declaration, but by necessity. She rationed the food. She organized sleeping shifts. She tended to the sick with her knowledge of herbs and practical medicine. The last to be rescued was Silas Croft. They found him in the ruins of his house, huddled with his wife, his last piece of a broken chair smoldering in the fireplace. His pride was gone, stripped away as surely as the bark from the trees. He was just a cold, frightened man. When he saw Elara standing in the doorway, he began to weep. The great, booming rancher who had built a palace for his cows was saved by the woman who had built a burrow for herself. For 3 weeks, the 30 survivors of Meridian lived in the thermal anchor. They lived in Vance's Folly. They lived because of the quiet widow they had scorned. In the warm, lantern-lit confines of the shelter, a profound and painful reckoning took place. They saw the wisdom in every detail of the construction, the constant, draft-free circulation of fresh air, the unwavering temperature, the deep stores of food. They saw that her folly was the most profound act of sanity the valley had ever seen. When the thaw finally came, and the world re-emerged, broken and scarred, the town of Meridian held a meeting. It was held in the open air, amidst the wreckage. Mayor Thompson stood before the survivors. He was a smaller man now, his suit hanging off his diminished frame. "We were fools," he said, his voice clear and steady. "We were proud and arrogant. We built with vanity, not wisdom. We valued glass over substance." He turned to face Elara, who stood at the edge of the crowd. "Elara Vance tried to warn us. She showed us the way, and we laughed at her. We mocked her. We named her work Vance's Folly." He took a deep breath. "We were wrong. You were right." Then Silas Croft stepped forward, his own face etched with a new humility. "My barn, my great, proud barn, was a monument to my own ignorance. It was destroyed in an hour. Your home, Elara, your shelter, it is a monument to wisdom. It saved us all. I am sorry. For my laughter, for my pride, I am sorry." Dr. Hemlock spoke last. "I dismissed your methods as unscientific. The irony is that my science failed me, and your wisdom saved my life. You understood the earth in a way I never did. You were right. We were all so terribly wrong." The public apology was absolute. It was a catharsis for the entire community. Elara stepped forward. She did not smile. Her expression was one of solemn grace. "Pride is a thin coat to wear in a blizzard," she said, her voice carrying over the silent crowd. "Nature does not reward vanity. It rewards preparation. The lesson is not to fear the storm. The lesson is to respect it. If you wish to survive, you will learn to listen to the land, not just to your own voices." She did not offer forgiveness, for there was nothing to forgive. Their folly had been their own punishment. She offered to teach, and they learned. The town of Meridian was rebuilt, but it was not rebuilt as it was. The new houses were built low to the ground, with thick walls and small windows. Many were built into the hillsides, using the principles of the thermal anchor. The phrase, "pulling a Vance," was reborn. It came to mean an act of profound foresight, of preparing with quiet wisdom while others scoffed. It was the highest compliment one could pay a person. Elara Vance lived for another 40 years. She never remarried. She never moved back into the town. She stayed in her shelter, her home, her sanctuary. She became the town's sage, its revered teacher. People would make the pilgrimage to her hillside to ask for advice on building, on planting, on reading the signs of the weather. She taught them what Elias had taught her. She shared the wisdom from the journals. She remained apart, a solitary figure of immense respect, but never truly one of them. She was a living reminder of their greatest failure and their ultimate salvation. She died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87 on a calm summer evening. The entire town mourned her passing. They buried her on the grassy roof of her shelter, the only place that seemed fitting. Years later, they placed a simple bronze plaque on the old oak door of the thermal anchor. It did not list her name or the dates of her life. It said only this: "When we build with pride, we build for the wind. When we build with wisdom, we build for our children."